Hey, morning, Old Hickory. How's everybody doing? All right, so this is a little bit different than the other ones we've had. The 30th obviously has been part of those. All right, 30th is not part of this. Operation Better, Yom Kippur, Arab-Israeli War. The big thing is why is this important to us? We're going to start off a little bit different and really tie this in and show why to the American military this is such an important conflict. Next slide. All right, the big thing here is this was the first large-scale conflict between NATO and Warsaw-equipped forces. All right, so we saw a lot of nasty things that occurred. We saw the Stagger missile introduced, the TOW, right, from the Israelis. We saw SAM missiles. There was all kinds of new technologies that were really coming to the forefront in the military. We sent U.S. investigative teams over there. We were really shocked at the destruction, accuracy, lethality of the battlefield. So what really came out of this thing is like in World War II, 17 shots at 700 meters to kill an enemy tank. That was what the requirement was. Here, 2 shots at 1,800 meters. So again, the lethality, the distance, the accuracy continues to improve here. It really blew the American belief that we could best superior numbers with technology. And so again, we saw, hey, Warsaw has the same technology, if not better technology than the US has. Coming out of Vietnam, that's the longest period of ongoing US conflict at that period of time, okay? Let's bring that back to today. I think we've bested that, right, by several years in where we are today. So again, continue to keep these things in mind while we're talking through this. So we sacrificed modernization to fund Vietnam, and while we were stagnant, the Soviets, the Warsaw, continued to improve and modernize. They got better. Due to that, what's often referred to as the lost decade by senior military individuals, right? Which is no major modernization equipment fielding from the mid-60s until the mid-70s. So again, just kind of demonstrating. And again, if you just take that 10 years and they call that the lost decade, I want you to really tie that into us and where we sit right now, and you'll see some of these things kind of coming home. Despite the fact that the Israelis were overmatched, right, in technology and numbers, the more capable crews and individuals and leadership proved the day, okay? They won the day. So with that, we'll see the creation of TRADOC occurred in 1973. General Dupay, okay, really pushed for realistic CTC training. One of the big things that happened coming out of World War II, where General Dupay was a member of the 90th Division. He saw 100% attrition in the first 6 weeks of conflict, right, of strength, and also 150% strength lost for officers. So again, it was like, how do you bring home the realistic training to make things as realistic as possible, simulate conflict? Next slide. So some of you may have heard of General Creighton Abrams, right? He's essentially considered the greatest armor officer in the history of the U.S. Army. He was the chief of staff from 1972 to 1974. Scared the hell out of him, right? When he saw what came out of Yom Kippur, it was like, we've got to get bigger, we've got to get faster, we've got to get more tech out there on the battlefield. He had his big 5 that he pushed for. The big 5, he wanted a new tank, he wanted a new infantry fighting vehicle, he wanted 2 helicopters, a combat helicopter, a support helicopter, and he wanted a missile system. Those missile systems and those helicopters, tanks, as you see up there, that's when they were introduced to the U.S. Army inventory. Should be a shock to you, right, of the modernization, the timeline that we're still using that equipment, right? So think about that as we're kind of going through here, as we go through the Yom Kippur and Operation Better brief. So one of the things that, again, I want you to kind of hold on to is while the brief is going on, and we'll kind of talk about at the end, is have we really modernized since the 1980s? And what I would ask you is, is the Bradley more accurate today than it was when it was first introduced? Is the Bradley more lethal than it was when it was first introduced? The M1, right? Have we extended range? Have we done anything to really increase our capability with those systems on the battlefield? Or have we simply just added technology to a Cold War platform? Or tweaked munitions that add more technology and get more range on the battlefield? Any of that technology that we've added, right, to our platforms, has it really made things easier, or has it made it more complex and our equipment less reliable on the battlefield? Have we been able to project our numbers like we need to? And then are we more capable and disciplined, leaders and crews and soldiers today than we were yesterday? And what have we done to really push that from our level? So without further ado, I'll pass it over to the TAD XO.
All right, good morning. All right, so I'm going to give you basically a general overview of how we're going to brief this slide deck here. But as the boss had mentioned, Israeli and Arab conflict. So this is a period of over 30 years of buildup and everything else. So we're really going to get focused in on Operation Better, which is at the beginning of the Yom Kippur War. It's going to focus on two fronts, the Suez Canal and the Golan Heights, and we'll show that here in a second. The focus is really on the dime principle. It's really getting into that and what the influences are from other countries, particularly the U.S. and the USSR at this time. Specific topics, you'll see that different things we'll touch on, but the big things for us, obviously, engineers, we're going to focus on the breach fundamentals and gap crossing for this particular war. And at the very end, we'll talk about some lessons learned. Next slide. All right, so time period, here we are. So Cold War era, this is where we are. You can see the timeline on the dash line there and where we actually are with Yom Kippur War. But you can see the United States was heavily involved with the Vietnam War as we led up to this. President Nixon was in the office at that time, and 6 months prior to Yom Kippur, we're actually pulling out of Vietnam. And so the buildup there with the Israeli and Arab conflict, you can start with from 1948 and all the way through to Yom Kippur. There's several key events that happen that bring us to that, particularly the Six-Day War, which really sets the conditions for how things are set up, where Israel has taken specific territory and set the conditions for where we are with Operation Better. And you can see the 3 days and how quick this goes, and you'll see the significance in what we're talking about with the operation. Next slide. All right, so just kind of lay out where we are with the key players, Israel, Egypt, and Syria. You'll see that, and we'll transition from the two fronts, the Suez Canal to the south and Golan Heights to the northern border. Next slide. All right, so why better? You'll see it, but better it's the code word that the Egyptians used to initiate the operation. It comes from the Arabic word full moon. It was actually a battle in 628 CE between 1,000 Meccans and 400 Muslims led by Muhammad, which the Muslims actually won that battle. This was basically the inception of Islam. The battleground, as we know today, is Saudi Arabia, and for those that are familiar with it, it's just south of Yanbu, the port of Yanbu. All right, and I'll be followed by the S2.
Good morning, Lieutenant Houston, retired S2. So I want to take you through some of the historical context. So as the XO mentioned, this Operation Better is the kickoff of the Yom Kippur War. But I want to kind of go through how did we get to this point in history. So for those of you aware, even if you're not really that spun up on what's going on in the Middle East or within Israel and Palestine, the tensions in this area have been ongoing for such a long time. They're still ongoing today. So there's a couple reasons for this. Religion is the big one. That can't be overstated. So the territorial claims based on religion is kind of what also drives this conflict. So as the XO already mentioned, there's a series of wars in the Arab-Israeli conflict. So the Yom Kippur War was actually the fourth Arab-Israeli war. So the ones leading up to that was the Israeli fight for independence, the Suez War, which Egypt and Israel were still fighting over the Suez Canal and the Sinai Peninsula, and they're fighting over natural resources and economic resources. So the Suez Canal provided a great economic resource for that region. And so in the Suez War, Egypt nationalized the canal. Obviously, Israel and Egypt fighting over this resource. That led to the Second Arab-Israeli War. So ongoing is this religious conflict that also both sides felt there was not going to be peace unless it was won. via a war. There was not going to be any concessions, anything like that. So this is kind of what led to the 6-Day War as well. And then, as we mentioned, 1973 was the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur War is the name that the Jewish people, the Israelis, gave it because that happened during their holy holiday, Yom Kippur, but it also happened during Ramadan, so a lot of Arab will call it the Ramadan War or the October War. Slide, please. So just kind of the geopolitical overview. So after the 6-Day War, Israel had gained territory. So they gained the entire Sinai Peninsula, control of the Suez Canal, as well as Golan Heights. So that is really the lead up into the Yom Kippur War. So this was basically a fight for territory, a fight for Israel, it was a fight for recognition as a state. So the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 was put into place after the 6-Day War. And essentially it was calling for Israel to remove their troops from the newly gained land in the Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, and asked for the Arab nations to recognize Israel as a state. Basically this was ignored by all parties, and the fighting continued. So, as we already mentioned, the War of Attrition happened after the 6-Day War, up through 1970. So, although it wasn't a specific battle, there was ongoing fighting. A lot of that was happening across the Suez Canal right here. So, Israel they knew that Egypt would likely try to take back that territory that they had just gained. And Egypt, although they had been beaten very decisively in the 6-Day War, was not giving up. So this was a constant artillery battle across the Suez Canal, and for that reason, that's kind of what led up to the Yom Kippur War. So the espionage. So the Yom Kippur War started off in 1973. Operation Better was the start of that war. So what the Egyptian president and military leaders have found during that time, something that's still important for us today, is the importance of OPSEC and the importance of holding on to the information that can protect your operations. So a lot of times their Egyptian plans have been leaked prior to these events. And so one thing that's really important for this war is that the Egyptian soldiers didn't know they were going to attack until really the night before. And that kept the plan safe. It kept anything from leaking out and going into Israeli hands. However, there was a double agent. So his name was Ashraf Marwan. He was an Egyptian official, assistant to the president, Anwar Sadat. He ended up being a double agent for Israel. So although he ended up leaking the plans of Operation Better, because of the operation security that Anwar Sadat had, he only gave about 24 hours notice to the Israelis. And then the last point I want to touch on right here is that Egypt really exploited weaknesses in Israel. So during the 6-Day War, Israel had three strengths: their armor, their air force, and their intel. And Egypt was able to find weaknesses in each one of these things prior to the Yom Kippur War. Slide, please. So some of the considerations to go through. As I mentioned, this is a battle for territory that was taken during the 6-Day War, and that they were fighting to get back in the Yom Kippur War. So some of the structures, the Suez Canal was really the delineation, and then Israel had built up defenses along the backside of the Suez Canal as well, which we'll get into a lot more detail on that in subsequent slides. So some of the capabilities, as our commander already mentioned, this war brought out a lot of new technologies. So the missiles and anti-tank weapons, those were ways that Egypt was able to overcome Israel's strengths. So we got Arabs and Jews fighting. As I've already mentioned, this is an ongoing conflict. In the next slide, I'll go into some of the individuals that were involved. And then the last thing I want to touch on is events. As I already mentioned, this is often known as the Yom Kippur War, but also the Ramadan War. So both sides are really, it's important for both of them for different reasons. And so that can't be overstated, because this happened on the eve of Yom Kippur. Israel had both figuratively and literally let down their defenses, which really impacted the attack. Slide, please. So here's some of the key players. We're not going to go through all of them. We'll get a lot more detail in some of the next slides, but just want to highlight the Egyptian president at the time was Anwar Sadat, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, Syrian president was al-Assad, and then just for situational awareness, we've got Richard Nixon as U.S. president and Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State. So as I mentioned, the Suez Canal is really the big point. So this is located right here. The next one, please. So Egypt, this is where they ended up attacking across the Suez Canal. And as I've already mentioned, the Barlow Line was a defensive line that was used to augment the already existing canal, which was an obstacle. And I'll leave you with this. So the Israeli Chief of General Staff mentioned that the Suez Canal was one of the best anti-tank ditches in the world. And then Israel, again, built that defensive line to kind of augment that. And that really leads us up to the operations that go into this battle. With that, I'll be followed by the chaplain.
So I'm going to give you 3 points here. My commander is looking for me for a religious area analysis, so I'm going to give that to you. So sacred locations, this is one location right here that was demolished during this battle. This is on the Golan Heights. And I would like to make a point right here. My commander needs to trust me. I've been trained by chaplains, and I've had a chaplain talk about a situation like this and tell me something based on my background. I couldn't trust that chaplain. So I'm advising you to pay attention to who you trust. You have to do your own homework in this. This battle, we've done our homework. We know what's going on in this area, boots on the ground where you are right now. And I'm advising you as a chaplain, all you commanders and you future commanders, to do your own homework on this. This is like a movie, but you're here, boots on the ground in the sand right now, surrounded by this situation, religious area analysis, and dealing with sacred locations, sacred dates, and religion and Holy Land. So sacred dates, my counterpart, the 2, has already given you information on sacred dates. All bets are off in this AO when it comes to sacred dates. It was then, in 73, it is now. You could go back and history repeats itself. 1776, December the 25th. Do your research. Religion, Holy Land. So I'm going to park right here for just a second. Okay, so this location is one of the holiest of the holy places from north to south. Battle taken on the north side and on the south side. So I propose to you, as a commander or a future commander, pay close attention to these issues right here. Work with your chaplains. Hopefully trust your chaplains. And then take this religion area analysis and keep your people alive. The goal here is to stay safe, go home alive, correct? My sergeant major tells me that the bomb can come in at any time, but we're pushing, we're jumping, we're going. So take this seriously, okay? Take this seriously. Now, let me close with this. Let's call it skin in the game. Look to your left and your right, and if you're wearing this uniform, you got skin in the game. Some of you are not wearing a combat patch, some of you are. Some of you have bled in this dirt, in this sand. Some of you have. Some of you, hopefully not, but probably, or maybe if you do future assignments, will bleed in this AO. You need to know this stuff. You need to understand the people of the indigenous populations in these AOs. I'm going to close with this. And I'm going to focus on just one group because I do not have time to focus on all of them. So let's just take the Israelis for an example. They believe that they've got skin in the game going back eons. They believe that the first blood that was spilled is in this AO. A brother accosted his brother and killed him. They believe that. They believe that God has situational awareness here. Whether you believe it or not, you need to know what they believe, because they have reason, skin in the game, to take you out. So let me close with this. Two brothers, one named Benjamin, one named Jonathan. One fighting on the north in the northern battle, one's fighting in the southern battle. One's 24 years old, a captain, a team member, fighting for his life, pushing forward, a captain. He survives. He's 70 years old now and running the country. He's got skin in the game. His brother died in that battle. His brother was a 30-year-old lieutenant colonel, died in the northern. Do your research. Understand what I'm trying to give you here and know where you're at, boots on the ground, what you're dealing with here. We're talking about lives and taking care of each other. I will be followed by Sergeant Graver.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Staff Sergeant Graver. I'm the medic for 236, or one of them anyway. So I am a medic, obviously. I'm going to be talking about the medical aspects of this war. Some pretty cool stuff here, so I think you'll enjoy it. So just some basic key points I'm going to hit on. Talk about casualties, the types of injuries, some of the medical assets they had, vehicles, and the formation of what we call Unit 669. You guys probably don't know what that is. Don't worry, you will when I'm done. So let's talk about the casualties first. As you can see there by the numbers, Israel was hit much harder, right? So they were taken by surprise. The casualty rate was fairly high, given one, because their medical equipment was very outdated. We'll get into a little bit of that. And because, of course, they were taken by surprise. So a lot more casualties on the Israeli side, which because of the heavy casualties that they take, kind of makes them think, hey, we need to kind of get better at developing better medical equipment. So something comes from Israel years later that I'm sure you've all heard of that we use fairly commonly today, although it has a different name today. You'll see what I'm talking about. So types of injuries. Very similar to what you see today. This was a very heavy tank war, so you didn't have as many gunshot wounds. You had a lot of shrapnel, you had burn injuries because you had flamethrowers, tanks, you had grenades, the minefields, artillery, all of that. So lots of various types of injuries. Obviously the technology that they had back then in terms of treatment was not even close to what we have today. Some of the medical assets and vehicles, Israel was very limited in their planning. They had misconceptions of how ready, of the Egyptian readiness. So, a little more prepared there. In terms of medevac vehicles, they had what are called ABCs, Army Personnel Carriers. They did end up building a few medical bunkers. They had a hospital that was established at the Sinai Peninsula. It's not there now. It was established at the time before the war. You also had the first emphasis on NBC, which is our nuclear, biological, chemical, medical protection. And it was very minimal, just to leave you at that. What comes later, though, is what we call Unit 669. I'll get to that in the next slide. In terms of medical equipment, one thing that comes out of Israel, you all know and love it, it's called what? The Israeli bandage. Israeli bandage. So that comes years later, but how does that relate to this particular war? Well, essentially, they got the butts kicked. They were using bandages from the mid to early 1940s. It didn't work well. So after the war was done, they're like, hey, we got to get better at this medical stuff. So Israel, over the next few years, created what we know now as the Israeli bandage. So it's pretty cool how that formed out of this war. Next slide, please. So, Unit 669, what is that? Who are they? Well, let me tell you. So essentially, they're equivalent to what we call the Air Force PJs today. They're essentially a paramedical rescue unit. They're like the top speed guys. You'll see on the two corners here, it's the Flying Cats is what they call them. That's their logo. But essentially, during the Operation Batter, they lost about 100 aircraft during combat. Many pilots were taken captive. Studies showed that they only had a slim chance of rescuing ejected pilots behind the enemy lines. So because of that, they formed this new unit, which is a medical extraction unit, Unit 669. Very equivalent to what we call the Air Force PJs today. So it's good stuff. And then, like I said, the logo's there. And then, next slide's fine. So here's just a kind of a final picture here. This is Unit 669. As you can see, this is pretty tough dudes. When they originally were selected, you were voluntold, essentially. So it was 12 guys, and then over time, that essentially evolved into what we see today, which is one of the most successfully recognized medical pararescue units that exist in all of our forces. So pretty tough dudes. And that's all I have medically. I'm going to be followed by Captain Ruff.
Good morning. The next few slides will show you a depiction of the primary pieces of technology and machines of war that took part in Operation Batter in the Yom Kippur War. On your left side, you have the Israeli tanks, the American-made, and in the middle, the Centurion, which was a British-made tank. The Israelis actually preferred the Centurion, and I'll get into that in a second. On your right, you have the T-62 and the T-55 Russian-made tanks that were used primarily by the Syrians and the Egyptians. The tanks were mostly similar with a few exceptions. You have about 10 rounds per minute that the Israelis were trained well enough to put on the target. So going back to what Colonel Henderson said about the average to kill a tank being 2 rounds at 1,800 meters, they could do that in almost 6 seconds. So that was part of the reason why they were able to be so effective in their tank warfare. So the rate of fire and then the range differences, you had slightly better range with the Centurion, and
and that was primarily due to the HESH round, which is that acronym you see down there, high explosive squash head. The Israelis were trained to start to fire this round out at 5,000 meters. So 5,000 being the absolute maximum range of that tank, not the maximum effective range, but the maximum range. And they were pretty much the only ones that could effectively use that round out that far. So the Russian tanks were not able to engage at that point. That squash head had a time delay fuse that would smack the Russian tank, and about a millisecond after pancaking on the outside of the armor, it would explode, and it was incredibly effective at detonating the ammo carousel that was inside the turret, and also the auxiliary tanks that were usually used on the backs of the T-55 and the T-62. The only other thing to hit on this is that the sights were very different. The American and the British-made tanks were only using ambient sights, so they did not have effective infrared sights as the Russians did. However, it turned out to be completely irrelevant during a few night fights that did take place in the Golan Heights. If you go to the next slide, this one shows the primary pieces of air power that took place. On your left, you have the Egyptian and the Syrian, and on your right, you have the Israeli. This was one of the first times the MiGs got into actual dogfights with the F-4 Phantoms, and the F-4 turned out to be a superior aircraft, primarily because after about 45 minutes, the MiG the pressure inside of its fuel tanks would begin to cause a problem at extreme speeds, and they would implode and cause a flame out in the aircraft. So it only had about 45 minutes of clean dogfight time, and this was put on display at one point when two F-4s engaged almost 28 MiG-21s and shot down 8 of them in the course of a 30-minute dogfight without any losses. So during Operation Badr specifically, there were over 200 MiGs and Sukhoi fighters that took part, and they operated primarily under the umbrella of the SAM missiles, which we'll show on the next slide. So these are your SAM missiles that the Egyptians used to cover their operation, and these were incredibly effective during the first part of the operation after they had executed their breach, and they kept the Israeli air power at bay. And this was a significant problem because the Israelis depended very heavily on their air power during the Six-Day War previously. The Model 95 is one of the pieces of the indirect that the Egyptians used. They didn't have 2,000 1955s, but they had 2,000 pieces of indirect that they brought to bear during that specific breaching operation. So you have 200 aircraft, and then you have 2,000 indirect that all opened up at the same time while they began their breach. So a massive amount of firepower. And then the AT-3 Sagger is your other primary piece of technology that changed the tempo of the way things went. In the Six-Day War, the Israelis depended very heavily on their tanks and their training dominance, and they did not account at all for any kind of technological advancement on the part of their adversaries. So after the breach occurred, which my counterparts will get into in a moment, the AT-3 Sagger turned out to be a significant problem for the Israeli counterattack. The only other item to hit that's significant for the future is the BMP-1. This was one of the first times that the BMP-1 came to be introduced into combat, and at this moment the American Army sort of realized that the Russians were beginning to get ahead of us at this point with an armored personnel carrier. We had not developed the Bradley yet, but the Russians had already begun to push forward with that kind of an armored personnel fighting carrier. So with that, I'll be followed by Major Day.
Good morning, my name is Major Day. I'm a Battalion Operations Officer, and at this point we'd like to take you through the tactical execution portion of our brief. Number one, we want to reorient you to the battlefield and reiterate that this was a war fought simultaneously on two fronts. It was the Egyptians attacking east across the Suez Canal into the Sinai Peninsula, and simultaneously the Syrians were attacking southwest into the Golan Heights region. Our team's analysis is going to focus on the Sinai front, which the Egyptians had codenamed Operation Better. Our team has broken these actions into 4 major phases: the planning and deception phase, the Egyptian attack, the Israeli defense, and the Israeli counterattack. We have not taken a friendly enemy point of view from this analysis, but we have taken the point of view from each of the belligerents by phase. Our team's analysis, we will provide by turn each of the Israeli and Egyptian perspectives, and we will provide situational awareness by turn of the actions that were going on in the Golan Heights. This operation was a demonstration of engineer breach doctrine and gap clearance fundamentals. I encourage you to watch as we go through for some of these elements as they present themselves, specifically regarding the gap crossing, with regards to surprise, extensive preparation, and speed. At this point, I'll be followed by Captain Bullister and Captain Suggs to take you through turn one.
Good morning. I'm going to talk about the planning, deception, build-up, and fortification on the Egypt side. So, as it was mentioned earlier, the loss of the Suez Canal and the loss of the peninsula was an economic and political nightmare for Egypt and Syria. Basically, not only did they lose the money from the oil fields and the shipping, but also it was a huge defeat because they viewed the Israelis as inferior. So to lose that was a political and economical black eye for them. So their main idea was to get rid of that. In 1971, there were no legitimate offensive plans. They had some like pie in the sky stuff, but nothing that was really gonna do anything. So with the in 1970, when the new president came in, Anwar Sadat, he basically sat down and made a legit, hey, what do we need to do and what can we do? So what they decided is, because Israel has such a fantastic air defense, and because the timing to get across the canal and everything else, that they're only their goal is a political means, their goal is to get the political win. So at the time, like it was mentioned earlier, Russia and United States are involved, but they're involved as superpowers. So there's brokerage, there's lots of meetings going on, and from 1971 down to 1973, those meetings actually come to a close because on one side, Israel's like, no, we got this, we're the best, there's no way you can beat us, and we have all this peninsula to take care of us before they actually get us. And on Egypt's side, they're like, there's no way we're even gonna acknowledge that these guys exist, let alone come to the peace tables with them. So Egypt came up with an idea is they're gonna use brinkmanship, meaning they're gonna come close to war, come close to war, come close to war, and let Israel react to that because they realized they could not have a land battle with them. So throughout the years, starting in 1968, they had various practices and various things they did, and they increased in complexity as they went. So by the time 1973 rolls around, Israel's like, no, it's okay. They're just uncovering and covering up their artillery because that's what they do in practice. It's okay because, you know, 2nd and 3rd armor is down there at the Suez Canal because that's where they're already stationed. And like movement at night, having the ships sent out earlier on and go to Yemen for refueling to make sure they're in place to do everything they need to do, that's okay because they're just doing this. So that overconfidence is what Egypt's main plan was to do. They used Russia and Syria. In 1971, they started talks. They came up with 2 plans. One was Operation 41, the other one was Operation Hyman Eretz. Hyman Eretz was kept quiet and secret and actually was renamed better later on, to the point where they didn't actually tell anybody what was going on until up to the 1st of October, where they actually sent the ships out with sealed envelopes to say, hey, you know, on the 6th, open this up and, you know, do your stuff. Complete radio silence. So for them, it actually started on the 1st. Various trips to the Soviet Union, talks with Syria. They knew that they could not take more, and Sadat actually mentioned he only needs a couple millimeters of the West Bank, of the East Bank, to get that position and then hold that for a political gain to get Russia and the United States together so they could actually, you know, get rid of this black eye they have. So various things they did. They got MiGs. They got during the 6-Day War and also the war of attrition that happened in between. They lost almost all their abilities, but they revamped all their armor, all their military, everything through Russia. And then kept everything quiet, used the overconfidence, and slowly but surely got themselves in a position where they actually, with Syria, they out-tanked them, and that 2-war front allowed them to move forward and get everything together. In 1973, that's when they actually set up, in August, that's when they actually set up, they're like, hey, we're gonna do the war, we're actually gonna do it this time, because all this other time, 1971, was the year of decision. But every time it happened, they just saw it as Arab saber rattling. And they're like, no, they're not going to do anything. These guys are just, you know, saber rattling. We're not going to do anything. But in 1973, in August, they said, listen, we're going to come up with 2 different plans. It's either going to be September 7th through 11th or October 5th through the 10th. And it wasn't until 1 month before where they actually signed between Syria and Egypt the declaration of war. So less than a month before, that's when Operation Banner was actually signed, pending, and ready to go. So that allowed everything that happened in secret without having going on, including they, because it was Ramadan on the Egyptian side, they said, hey, listen, we had all these mobilizations, but they said they had a fake demobilization, and they also put out to everybody, hey, listen, if you want to go ahead and do your Hajj or your pilgrimage to Mecca, you can go ahead and get off work and do that, and they didn't let that happen. So they were actually able to catch Israel off guard, as far as like such a big movement, including starting in 1971, practicing their movements, but the big one for this, and they'll mention it later on, is they figured out how to breach the main defense going from 6 to 8 hours down to 2 hours with hydraulic water pumps. I'll be followed by Captain Suggs.
Hey, good morning, I'm Captain Suggs. So I'm going to be briefing Israel's planning, build-up, and fortification prior to the execution of Operation Better. As you can see here on the slide, these triangles right here going all the way down the Suez Canal. Those triangles are forts and strong points that Israel built into the Bar-Lev line. Their concept for the Bar-Lev line was to take the pre-existing obstacle of the Suez Canal and reinforce it with a 60 to 80 foot high sand wall, reinforced by a concrete wall to prevent any armor or infantry incursion into the Sinai Peninsula. That really prevented Egypt from taking any action to cross the Suez Canal. So Israel began construction of the Bar-Lev line following the War of Attrition in 1968, and it cost between $250 and $300 million in 1973 money. So it cost a lot of money, took them a long time to construct, and this was a huge source of national pride and military perfectionism that they were trying to display, touting that they had the most impenetrable obstacle in the world. So it was supported by the 22 forts and 35 strong points. What they did to secure these forts and strong points, they had minefields, trenches, barbed wire, and sand embankments that were all supporting these forts and strong points, and they're stretched between 1,000 and 5,000 meters apart across the Bar-Lev line. The Bar-Lev line also had a built-in firewall, so they had an oil pipeline built in across the Bar-Lev line. What they would do is they would pipe crude oil into the Suez Canal that they could ignite and create a wall of flame, so that they prevent the Egyptians from coming across the Suez. We'll find out shortly why that didn't work at all. They also built an elaborate road system to the east of the Bar-Lev line that they used to shuttle troops back and forth. And they had two major defensive plans, Dovecote and the Rock. Dovecote relied on the 252 Armored Division. Shout out to Thunderbolt. Right. So they relied on the 252 Armored Division to reinforce the Bar-Lev line. It also had 12 infantry companies, 17 artillery batteries, giving them over 300 tanks, 70 pieces of artillery guns, and almost 18,000 troops to defend the line. If that didn't work, they had two additional armored divisions in reserve that could reinforce it when they instituted the Rock plan. What gave Israel so much confidence in this plan was that they expected to have 24 to 48 hours of intelligence prior to receiving that. Egypt used several false alarms by posturing the military, and that cost Israel $10 million apiece each time they reacted to Egypt's posturing. So they kind of got lulled into complacency. There was a Syrian air battle between Israel and Syria in September, and Israel won that quickly. So when Syria started posturing their forces, Israel just reacted to it like it was a defensive plan. And when the Soviet advisors were evacuated out of Cairo and Damascus, that's really when Israel kind of sent up the red flag that there was an issue. But that only allowed them between 5 and 9 hours to activate their armies on October 6th. So it was a massive failure of their intelligence, and because they overestimated their own abilities, underestimated their opponent's reactions, it led them being unprepared for the attack that was coming. So I'll be followed by Sergeant Cummings and Lieutenant Phoenix.
All right, so as that was going on, and I'm going to give you a situational awareness in the Golan Heights that was happening. So bottom line up front, what was going on, the reason why the Golan Heights is that the Syria want to take back their land in the Mount Hermon area of the Golan Heights. So they felt like if they get onto the Mount Hermon area on the top of the mountain, they were able to oversee the Israeli soldiers and take that property back and take that land and take the Israeli soldiers out of the fight. So at this time of the plan, these were two main players, is the Egypt president and also the Syria president during this time. All that planned since September of '71. And I was briefed by Lieutenant Phoenix.
Okay, so I'm Lieutenant Phoenix. I'm the battalion S1 for the 236. So I had Israel. I'm going to refer to it as IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. So during this time, they didn't really have too much time to plan. It was also the day of the Day of Atonement, so prayer, fasting, and repenting for sins. And so again, they didn't really have too much time to plan, and so that was a good indication for Syrian forces to come in and do their thing. And one thing that did help these IDF forces were tank ditches. So this falls back to the 6-Day War. Because they built that made the Syrians fall into that trap, a very easy trap. And then I'm going to hit on IDF forces. So on hand, with the limited time prep, they had 60 light infantry, 60 artillery pieces, and 2 understrength armored brigades, and 170 tanks. So with the 170 tanks, they had the shock tail to their advantage. That was their choice of tank. And it was 152 millimeter frontal armor, 105 millimeter rifle cannon, and a 3600 Ranger meters. So all now be followed by capture.
Good morning. Operation Better actually begins at 1400 hours at 06 October. The actions actually begin the night before with engineers who sneak across the canal and sabotage those oil pipes that were designed to dump oil into the canal and set them on fire. At 14:05, Egypt actually opened up with a massive artillery barrage and an airstrike. In the first opening minutes, 10,500 rounds were struck on the fortifications and the C2 nodes along the Bar-Lev line. When this is happening, this is the suppression for the first movements across the canal. 10 groups of 10 began to cross the canal, up and down along the 150 long kilometer canal. They would go up the berm, across the berm, and the Israelis had these pre-dug fortifications and these pre-dug ramparts for their tanks. The idea was the tanks would then, when they're alerted, would move up, get into these pre-dug positions, provide that overwatch and those fires on the berm. Well, because the Israelis were thinking the attack was going to start at 1800 and not at 1400 when it took off, their tanks weren't in position. These teams were able to get into these positions and set up ambushes with the brand new AT-3 Stagger missiles and with their RPG teams. What this looked like was they would get in position, they had set up their Stagger missiles along the side, they had a little sighting device they would use, and a little joystick to control this wire-guided missile. They launched the missiles, the tank came up to 3,000 meters out, and take it out. The Israelis had no idea what these things were. They were stunned. They began to maneuver and try to maneuver these into these positions and find new positions. Around this time is when their RPG teams would pop up in other areas. They knew right where the Israelis were going to go and hit them on the side with the RPGs. Again, of the 91 tanks that were pre-positioned up by the Bar-Lev line, only about 5 survived the first few hours. While this is going on at the same time, around 1420, 4,000 men begin to move in 750 boats across the canal and hit the berm. They're armed with, again, more Stagger-3 missiles and RPGs, and they have rope ladders that they lay on the berm to help them scale up the berm a whole lot faster. While they're making this crossing, the artillery then shifts fire and begins laying smoke to provide that obscuration as they move across the canal. At this point, I'll be followed by Lieutenant Gilmore.
Good morning. As we already mentioned, Israel was ill-prepared for this attack. Despite the intelligence that they had received, because they had been lulled into complacency, they weren't prepared at the Bar-Lev line. The combination of Yom Kippur, as well as their armor being held in reserve, kind of made them extremely vulnerable. So as the attack took place, that first 58-minute barrage took out the communications, as well as their surface-to-air support and jam, and allowing the Egyptian advance to take place and for them to gain the initiative. Next slide.
This just gives you a look at what the Stagger missiles look like. You can see the sighting device there, the little joystick on the left, as well as the missile. And here's a picture of the Egyptians in position and waiting for the Israelis to come up. They got 2 Stagger missiles sitting off to the right. The Egyptians waiting here to take them out. Down in the left corner down there, you can see how this actually shows you how big this berm actually was. Gives you a really good visual. And this is a picture of the first 4,000 that came across. And you can see the boats down there on the bottom. And this is an RPG, the RPG-7 that they were using at the time. Next slide. All right, as that first wave, that first 4,000 began to go across, they also have combat engineers with them. These combat engineers and commandos as well, their mission was to go out and reach any minefields and things along the avenues of approach to the Bar-Lev forts, as well as they began to set up ambushes for any reinforcements that were due to come up to reinforce the Bar-Lev line. While this is going on, Egypt then began to send across 70 different engineer teams. These are hydraulic water teams. These guys Egypt had bought about 300 pumps from England and 150 pumps from Germany years before. These pumps were big high pressure water pumps. They'd take the hoses, dump them into the canal, and then point the hoses at the berm. And the idea was they'd reduce the berm by hydraulic mining. It worked really well. They were able to get their time in doing this down to 2.5 hours. When they're done, they've got 60 breaches through the berm. Providing cover for all this is the new SAM-6 missiles. These are in place strategically around the crossings to essentially negate the Israeli Air Force. During the 6-day war, as we talked about earlier, all right, Israel crushed Egypt, gave them a big head. Well, they did it with 2 things, their Air Force and their tanks. Well, the SAM-6 missiles really just negated their Air Force's capabilities. Essentially, the Egyptians are making this crossing a very little challenge. Their forces are pushed back, and the Air Force can't provide that cover and take out the bridges and the tanks as they begin to come across. All about Lieutenant Gilmore.
So going on with the attacks and the implementation of the SAM from the Egyptian army, we see that the Israeli Air Force wasn't able to launch a counterattack. Their first attempts were meaningless at best, losing 34 Skyhawks and 600 Phantoms. In addition to this, because of the use of the Egyptian commandos and the Stagger missiles, they also lost 200 to 300 tanks in the first 2 days of the battle. So the combination of the fog of war, the inability of Israel to be prepared for this attack, all kind of culminated this first 2 days, and having to fight it on 2 fronts with very minimal command and control, ended up resulting in tremendous casualties and losses, with over 200 Israeli soldiers being captured and all the strong points on the Bar-Lev line being captured within the first 2 days of fighting.
So you can see in this slide, we got a couple shots of the pumps breaching the berm. While the hydraulic operations are going on at the same time, engineer units begin to bring up on transports the bridge sections. They begin to dump these bridge sections into water, and the Egyptians begin to assemble their bridges. At the same time that's going on, there are 31 prefab ferries that immediately get put into action, begin shuttling across troops and light equipment across to the far side, begin reinforcing those 5 bridgeheads that are on the far shore. By 1730, there are 32,000 men across the bridge, or across the gap. And they have pushed their bridgeheads out to 2 miles. By 1830, the water hoses had breached the first complete breach through the berm. By 2030, there were 60 breaches along the berm. The first bridge was completed by 2030. By 2230, there were 8 heavy bridges and 4 light bridges, all operational, beginning to move equipment, tanks, and personnel across the bridge. Now you might be thinking this is a logistical nightmare, and it is. The Egyptians have thought of that. Their MPs were tasked with directing traffic. Every unit that was to go across had a number. They knew what breach they were going to go through. The breaches themselves were marked with luminescent signs at the top of the berm. They would then, oh, that's my number, I'm going to go through the breach. MPs made sure all this happened. You follow by, Lieutenant Gilmore. Oh, no, never mind. All right, so throughout 7 October, Israeli infantry began to also penetrate through and did have some success trying to get to the bar-lev line. These units are going to get isolated, surrounded, and destroyed. They will damage a couple bridges, but the Egyptians are able to repair them. By October 7th, there's going to be 50,000 men and 400 tanks on the Sinai. The Egyptians are going to begin to dig in, reinforce, resupply, and be ready for any kind of Israeli counterattacks. The Air Force of the Israeli side begins to have some success. They're beginning to start hitting some of the SAM's missiles, but they're still not doing a whole lot. They actually hit, they think they hit 7 different bridges. The Egyptians actually had some decoy bridges out there that were actually throwing the Israeli Air Force off. By the end of the 7th, there were 10 heavy bridges across the canal. They had expanded their bridges wider, they were almost together. By the end of the day, the Egyptians had lost, the end of the first 2 days, the Egyptians had lost 20 tanks and lost 280 soldiers. Israel, on the other hand, had lost 200 to 300 tanks, lost 200 soldiers to death, and 200 were POWs. Next slide. Followed by, sorry, comments.
So as this is still going on in the Golden Heights, the Syrian soldiers saw that they were being defeated by the Israeli soldiers due to their tactics and their tanks. So therefore, the Syrian soldiers diverted their tactics to at night fighting because of the infrared that they had on their tanks that provided by the Soviets. So at the same time, while they were doing the fight, they had allies from Syria, Morocco, Libya, and Jordan at the same time. So just imagine 1 million soldiers in this fight. I would follow by the Philippines.
So for the counterattack for Israel, Sergeant Cummings mentioned the infrared light. So the IDF forces had the binos that were able to detect that 1,200 meters away. And so for the IDF forces, Lieutenant Colonel Kakulani, he was literally meters in front of Syrian forces. So because of their quick gunnery skills and quick thinking and quick tactics, he was able to take them out one by one. And then also to keep in mind 18 hours of continuous fighting. And then also the 77th and the 79th were up in the north, so it was very congested up in the north, whereas in the south, the Syrian forces were very unstoppable. They were just flooding down to El Al, which will go into the after counterattack. I will now be followed by Captain Warren.
All right, almost halfway through. So Egypt's now on the east side of the canal. They're attempting to reconsolidate their 5 divisions, 3 on the north, 2 on the south. And there's still fighting going on. As previously mentioned, Egypt is having to break down those bridges and move them, which is causing logistical resupply issues. That's leaving them to cross back over the canal to resupply. So it's very difficult, all this movement. This led to fratricide issues, the most notable of which was 2 tank platoons got into a fight with each other and left 2 of 3 tanks in each friendly platoon killed. So this led the engineers to come up with an idea to build land bridges. So that would allow them to have avenues across the canal that weren't susceptible to Israel attack. And this ultimately led to the decision that they were going to have to expand their bridgeheads, give them a little more wiggle room while they were building that. So they pushed further east, about 8 to 15 kilometers. This caught Israel off guard. They did not expect Egypt to attack again so quickly. So they were successful and ended where they were when Israel had their main counterattack. I'll be followed by Sergeant First Class Burris.
One. Around October 7th, Israel started planning a counterattack against the Egyptians. While they were planning that counterattack, they had several airstrikes that they carried out. On the night, they started asking the U.S. for support to help them out. Between the 9th and the 10th, they kind of went back and forth, attacking each other, but really didn't make any gains on it. Between the 10th and the 13th, both sides refrained from any kind of large-scale operations. And then finally, between the 12th and 13th, the U.S. started sending additional arms to Israel. I'll be followed by Sergeant First Class Cummings.
All right, so this is turn 3. So as like I previously mentioned, that by this time the Israeli soldiers is pushing the Syrian soldiers back to their across their border. So at this time they're losing a fight, and that's when the Israeli take over.
Okay, so at this time, like Sergeant Cummings mentioned, they were down in El Al, which is in the south, and they pushed the Syrians back to the Syrian believe it was 10 miles from the Syrian border to Damascus is where the fight actually started and kind of finished. And that also goes into Hujnia to Damascus, and then it also goes into the Valley of Tears. And we'll get more on that in the next slide. So I will now be followed by Captain Wood.
All right, at this point, we've got Egypt's 2nd Army in the north, 3rd Army in the south, both on the east bank here. Israel decides to attack west. We've got heavily mined roads here. Egyptians have mined the roads, dug in defensive positions, infantry's dug in, and we've got a bunch of anti-air and logistics units on the west bank, but pretty unsuspecting Egyptian force on the west bank, unable to really react to any Israeli infantry coming over their territory.
Click once, please. Okay, up until this point, nothing significant had happened. So we're going to start talking about Operation Stout-Hearted Men, which started with the Battle of the Chinese Farm, October 15th through the 17th. So prior to, Israelis found that there was a gap at Deversoir here that separated Egyptian 2nd Army from the 3rd Army, which is further down south. So what they did was they were able to cross here, they laid down a bridge, and they sent their 3 armored divisions, 2 up north to take over Ismailia. I'm sorry, 1 up north to take over Ismailia and 2 down south to surround Egyptian's 3rd Army. So when they opened that route to attack south and west, they also assembled a platoon and a roller bridge to cross the canal and push toward Srejom. Next slide, please. So to continue, now we're going to talk about the Battle of Ismailia. Ismailia is important because it provides a lot of supplies to Egypt's 2nd Army, which is up here up north. So they sent over the paratrooper battalion, which occupied the 5 strong points here at Deversoir between Jebel Mariam and the pumping station. They also captured Orchid Hill, which collapsed the Egyptian defenses. 2 of the 3 armored divisions I've already talked about went down south to attack south and west. They bypassed Suez City here, and they ended up in the port of Adebayo, which is right about here. That's where Egypt's 3rd Army was located. They also sent their Air Force to launch aerial attacks on Ismailia and Al-Balagh Army Base and Jebel Mariam. So those 2 armored divisions, once they surrounded Egypt's 3rd Army by bypassing Suez City into the port of Adebayo, they also ignored 2 UN ceasefires, and on October 25th, they finally ceasefire as the U.S. pressured them to.
One of the interesting things to note for Egypt is that the generals were not getting good reports that the Israelis had crossed over to the West Bank. So those planning in Cairo, trying to array their forces, were not getting good reports, and ultimately ended up having to go forward to see the battlefield for themselves. Now, the Egyptian 3rd Army was surrounded in the south, heavy fighting still in the north, but that army being surrounded in the south and the imminent annihilation really accelerated ceasefire talks. Henry Kissinger got very involved in stepping in with the UN and talking to each side and getting them to agree on a ceasefire. We followed by the Golan Heights situation.
So as this is coming to an end of the fight of the Golan Heights, basically the Syrian soldiers find out that they are defeated by the Israelis. So therefore they are coming to an end, and this when the Soviet Union basically stated that if they will continue to fight and they will send their soldiers in, so that's when the United States stepped in and stated that if you continue, we will also up our army and we will send those troops in as well. And that's when the Soviet Union stepped down the very next day.
So a couple key points with Israel winning into the battle is that it was an agreement on disagreement. So it was basically like a peace treaty that they would not cause any other battles to go on from this point. And then also any POWs from either side were returned and back to their respective units, respective units. And then one thing that I liked about my research with IDF forces was that they had really great gunnery skills, movement techniques, flexible command structure, and another takeaway that I liked was there was only 3 combat veterans, and the rest were all fairly new soldiers. So even with that limited prep time of typically 20 hours, they only had 10 hours to prepare. So they were able to act quickly, and in the end, they were able to win. So it was really great. And then my pictures down below, just Israeli forces celebrating their win at Golan Heights. I will now be followed by Major Dan.
All right, so everything that we've taken you through so far were the major combat operations of the Yom Kippur War. And then keep in mind, right now we're at the end of October, so all of this that you've seen has taken place across the course of about 20 days. So where we're at right now is Israel has counterattacked across the Suez and is now in Egypt and maneuvering within striking distance of Cairo. Egyptian forces have a unit on the Sinai side of the Suez that's cut off and surrounded. And Israel has defeated Syria on the Golan Heights front and is maneuvering towards Damascus. So that's kind of where we end right now, or where we end with the combat operations. And at this point, there's been multiple peace treaties that continue to be brokered. Israel has the momentum. They continue to maneuver. They're trying to achieve gains. However, national and international pressures limit their ability to be able to gain more. So as we go forward over the next coming months, finally we get to a point where in April 1974, multiple months later, it's finally, the peace is finally brokered and all belligerents return to their corners. Henry Kissinger was really, we mentioned him earlier, was instrumental in brokering the peace, multiple trips, traveling back and forth across the world, and it was actually coined the term shuttle diplomacy for all of his negotiations and travel. But really, where we end here with all of this is Israel viewed as the tactical victor. However, they were the strategic loser. They were able to reconsolidate and reorganize and defend their ground. However, they were caught unprepared and by surprise. Israel conducted an investigation after all of this, which resulted in the removal of multiple heads of their military and intelligence. And Golda Meir ends up resigning 9 days later following the investigation. Egypt, viewed as a strategic victor. They were able to restore their national pride. We had mentioned they had been devastated in the Six-Day War. So they've regained their foothold in the Sinai. And ultimately, years later, this leads to them regaining control of the Sinai Peninsula in exchange for recognizing Israel as a nation, which happened at the 1978 Camp David Accords. Syria really didn't achieve much of anything out of this. They achieved some negligible, non-strategic territory in the Golan Heights, but really not much more than that. And to this day, there still is a buffer zone policed by the UN on the Israeli-Syria border. So a couple of things just to capture from the tactics here. Won't mention all of these, just you guys can read. But as far as the key points, really wanted to mention the Sagger missiles and the RPGs, how effective those were against the tanks. The other thing was that the hydraulic burn breach was incredibly unorthodox, but it was ingenious. It wasn't something that was expected, and it worked incredibly. As far as the takeaways, really, you saw the extensive planning. Years, Egypt had planned for this, procured equipment, had this rehearsed, had this planned under secrecy, and they had a strategic goal. So having that end state and that extensive preparation really led to their success. The complacency that we saw in Israel. Israel thought that they couldn't be defeated, that the Suez Canal and their Bar-Lev line could not be breached. They were overconfident, they underestimated their adversary, and they were caught by surprise. Armed forces can't be the reliance on technology can't stand alone by itself. The basic soldier skills, maneuver, tactics need to be rehearsed and focused. The combined arms focus can't be lost. It will lead to a lack of synchronization and ultimately, as we said, underestimating our adversaries, their will, their resolve, and their ability to advance technologically can lead us to disaster. So those are our key takeaways. For For final comments, I'll turn it back over to the Sergeant Major and the Commander to wrap everything up. Good morning. Good thing about CME is you're like 2-3 minutes out, and that's all it's going to take. The commander's going to come drop the mic when you're out of his tent, okay? All right, so there's 2 things I'm going to talk about. It's going to be morale and experience, all right? So morale, I'm not talking about building them another Burger King. I'm not talking about letting them wear their hair down with a 9-gauge PT. I'm not talking about giving them an award or a coin just for breathing and walking and chewing gum at the same time. Morale, I'm talking about taking a soldier and training them and giving them the equipment to go up against a battle of something that's already handed them defeat in the past. Here you take Egypt and Syria, the soldiers, it talks about from the 6-day war on up, how there were events that happened that Israel was still using it against them by using training flyovers and everything. Hey, this is what it did it to you before, this is what's going to do it to you again. Okay? So that'll get on you, especially when you tell a soldier, here's your M4 AK-47, go fight those tanks. That's pretty stupid. A lot of us say we've been through this stuff before, who've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. We haven't been through this. This is a lot of stuff going on out here, okay? We've seen some pop shots, we've seen some, the thief in the night we call the IED, we fought that in past wars, but to have all this going on the ground, you need to be trained, you need equipment, okay? So you take when they came back and they start before 1973, leading up to it, they trained their soldiers better, the Egyptians and Syrians. They trained them up a little bit better. They gave them something to fight that steamy-eyed missile man coming out of the clouds, which was the SAMs, anti-aircraft. They gave them the infantry, some mobile, anti-tank, anti-aircraft equipment. They gave them a little bit more confidence, and they gave them determination. Told them what they're fighting for. Now they have something to go out into battle and stop the thing that stopped them in their tracks in the past, okay? And it took training, and it took experience, and it takes repetition, okay? On the Israel side, they had so minimal of people on the Sinai and the Golan Heights, but they were able to recover because their soldiers were more highly trained. So as they engaged in them, they did come through and bust through, but they were able to recoup and reinforce themselves in a timely manner because they were trained and more experienced. Okay? There's a lot of lessons learned from this. One big thing for me is every time I go to a training event, I always tell people, when you go out there and do that culminating event, when you go out there and you're breaching the gap, or you're out there in the middle firing the Mink Lake off, and we're doing a big combined arms event, put yourself out there training, but think of bullets flying over your head. That'll make it more interesting for you. We're not lollygagging here and there. Okay? Now, let's put a little bit more into it, because now my speech is going to be a little bit more when I go to a training event. Make sure, when you go out there and do this training, make sure you think of bullets flying over your head, freaking jets coming out of the clouds shooting at you, and infantry shooting freaking Tiger missiles and everything at you. So you make it more. It makes it a little bit different if you think about that and you're out there doing your training event and the bullets are really flying over your head, okay? So the morale of the soldiers, by giving them more training, by giving them those weapons, they were able to go out there and fight those tanks and make a difference. Now, they were still handling their defeat, but they were still able to make a difference because you gave them the equipment and training to do what they needed to do, okay? One last thing I want to talk about is the significance of 1973. That was the first year that the Sergeant Major's Academy graduated a class. Okay, that was founded in 1972 to graduate in 1973. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tank.
All right, threw a lot of information at you. Where's our 1973 Yom Kippur War now where we're at? Right, hopefully you've had a chance to digest and focus on some of these questions right that we threw out there at the beginning. But where's the old tanker? Somebody's over 25. How many years you been in?
20 years.
20 years. Anybody older than that, tanker? All right, so in your 20 years, is the M1 more accurate than it was when you came in?
Accurate, yes, sir.
Does it fire farther than it did when you came in?
Range is about the same, sir.
All right. So where's my artillery officers, NCOs? Anybody? Wow, nobody from 113. Nobody? Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. What about infantry, Bradley? So we got some old guys up here. Gentlemen, what do you think? Is it
It doesn't shoot farther.
All right, so again, when you go back and you look at some of those numbers that I put up, right, in North Carolina, right, what a car over 20 years is what considered a classic, right? So here we are with equipment that's 40 plus, years old or going on 40 years old. And I think what we would kind of argue is that those are the same Cold War platforms, right, that we've been operating on, right, since the early 1980s. Yes, we've added technology to them. Yes, we've added improved munitions to them. But for the most part, those are the same technology platforms and combat platforms that we've been operating off of over the last 40 years. So who here, again, back to the armor in the back. Yes, sir. Is the M1 easier to get up and operational today than it was when you first came in? So all this technology that we've really added to these platforms, has it really made us more lethal if we have more trouble and challenges getting our equipment up? So what I would really kind of close with, and Sergeant Major hit on it, we hit through it, right? It's what are the things that we can control? We can't control new combat platforms being fielded at us as leaders and soldiers. We can't control, right, the technology that gets put in our vehicles and how that gets fielded, right? But what we can control is the training, the repetition, right, the rehearsals that we do with our soldiers to ensure that we're the highest trained, most capable, and competent leaders and soldiers that we have. So again, have we as leaders done everything that we can to ensure that we're more prepared than our adversaries on the battlefield? All right, so any comments? Goes over to Lieutenant Colonel Wynn. All right, y'all are done. Appreciate it. Oh, Hickory.